Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We thought we'd dive in. One of the premises of this project is that religion just is. It's a factor in the world. There are many, many people who lead religious lives, and it's kind of overlooked to our detriment. And it's particularly easy for that to happen amongst Western journalists. And so the thought today is that whether with respect to the resurgent, virulent return of anti-Semitism in France and perhaps more broadly in different parts of Europe, whether with respect to national populism, even playing a subtle role, a partial role in that larger global trend, or tomorrow in climate change and the environment and anti-poverty efforts in sub-Saharan Africa, religion is a factor, and that as journalists we can overlook it to the detriment of our readers and maybe even ourselves. And so today we get to hear from an exemplary French writer who has written most recently about recent resurgence of anti-Semitic hate in this book by Marc Weitzmann titled Hate, the Rising Tide of Anti-Semitism in France and What It Means for Us. And he talks about how hate has capitalized on isolation and on far-right populism, on ignorance, on war wounds from nearby lands, Syria, Libya, and beyond, and on Islamist religious impulses, as well as resurgent anti-Semitic inner demons from this country that go back to people like Charles Maurras over a century ago in Paris. So let me quickly introduce our speakers and we'll jump in. Marc Weitzmann was recommended after this group gathered here 2 years ago by multiple participating journalists as a speaker. And I personally struggle, I want to speak for other American journalists in the room, but I personally struggle still to try to really understand what laïcité is. He has been writing about this for years, was shocked from a distance by the recent rise of Marine Le Pen and now Eric Zemmour, rising anti-Semitism in recent years. Marc has written 12 books, both fiction and nonfiction. He hosts a radio program on France culture called Signs of the Times. He's a regular contributor at Le Monde and Le Point in Paris, in France, as well as writing for Tablet magazine and several outlets in the United States. This new book won 3 major book awards, was shortlisted for France's Medicis Prize, and it's going to form the basis of his remarks today, about 15 to 20 minutes of overall conversation. After Marc speaks for that time, we'll hear from Jeff Goldberg, who last month passed his 5-year mark as editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, which has achieved just incredible growth under his leadership. Jeff has written for The Atlantic since 2007, and in addition to 3 fellowships and a 2006 book on the Middle East divide, Prisoners, Jeff has won a list of reporting awards too long to list, including America's National Magazine Award for Reporting, the Daniel Pearl Prize, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists Prize. Jeff will speak for about 15 minutes, sort of broadening the conversation from France alone to the continent more broadly, to Europe more broadly. And then because in preparing for this, Jeff has interviewed President Obama and Mattis and so many interesting people over the years for The Atlantic. Instead of just diving directly into Q&A, the two of them are going to have a little chat before we then turn to you. So maybe about 10 or 15 minutes of conversation between the two of them, and then over to you. And when it's time, some of you are veterans. If you wouldn't mind just flagging with your table tent that you're ready to get in, we'll keep a list up here, and we'll have about a half an hour of conversation on the record. We'll break for coffee for 15 minutes and then come back for one more full hour of conversation, which is often the richest part of these. Thank you both for being here. Marc Weitzmann, appreciate your kicking off Faith Angle Europe. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. So I figured the easiest way to go is to give you a brief account of the circumstances that led me to write that book. And it will provide you with a background of the current situation in France, so we can discuss it afterwards. 2014 was a bad year for the Jews in France, despite the fact that what I'd call the estrangement of French Jews can be traced back to the fall of the year 2000, when the oriented coverage of the Second Intifada by the French media resulted in the first stone throwings against synagogues in several suburbs around Paris. despite the fact that during the following years, there was an inner exodus of Jewish families forced to leave their neighborhood and regroup in others due to the harassment of Jewish kids, the harassment Jewish kids were submitted to at schools. And in many, if not most cases, even secular assimilated Jews had to take their kids off public schooling and place them in safer private Jewish religious establishments. Despite the fact that the first murder of a Jew occurred during the winter 2003 in the person of Sebastian Selam, that was stabbed in the throat and in the eyes by his childhood friend Adel Mastaibu, who after the killing came running from the basement the murder had taken place into the street of Belleville in Paris, his hands covered with blood and yelling, "I'll go to heaven, I've killed my Jew." This was during the demonstrations against the war in Iraq, during which people identified as Jews were sometimes chased in the street by some demonstrators. Despite the fact that in 2006, Ilan Halimi was abducted, tortured for 3 weeks, and killed by a bunch of 20 kids who called themselves the Gang of the Barbarians, because they thought that Halimi's parents, being Jewish, were rich and could pay good money. And because they couldn't pay the money, they killed the kid. Despite the fact that the Charlie Hebdo trial in 2007, when Charlie Hebdo was sued by the Saudi Muslim League for having printed the famous caricatures of the Prophet, the question was raised in Muslim suburbs. Why, how come that you could make fun of our religion, which is Islam, and not of their religion, which is the Shoah? That question was spread across the country by the black popular anti-Semitic comedian Dieudonné as he toured across the country, inviting Holocaust deniers on stage with him, all this backed with Iranian money, as he himself publicly acknowledged at the time in 2009. Despite the trial of the Gang of the Barbarian in 2009, during which the anti-Semitic nature of the Halimi's murder was denied by most of the French press, and more crucially by the prosecutor himself, who during the trial also managed to publish a non-biographical book of sorts in which he praised his father, who turned out to have had a career in the Vichy administration during World War II. Despite the fact finally that the Ozar HaTorah school was targeted by Mohamed Merah in 2012 in Toulouse, an anti-Semitic terror attack during which 3 young Jewish kids were assassinated in the street and in full daylight. Despite all this, 2014 was a particularly bad year for the Jews in France. It started in January with a demonstration led by a series of groups of far-right, anti-Republican, anti-gay marriage, anti-left political organization and monarchist organization that called themselves the French Spring, and who called the demonstration the Day of Wrath. During this demonstration, you could hear for the first time since the 30s the slogan, "Jew, France is not yours." Right after that, the level of anti-Semitic incidents arose drastically across the country. And in retrospect, it is the weirdness and the spontaneity of those incidents that is the most telling. People jumping at the throat of their neighbors, for instance, yelling, "Dirty Jew, we're going to burn you." People being slapped in the streets by total strangers for wearing a Star of David. A train on the Paris-Brussels line stopped in the middle of nowhere while a voice in the loudspeakers asked Jewish passengers to change train for Auschwitz. This happened in February 2014. And of course, people beaten in the streets for wearing a yarmulke, a woman raped during a burglary in an apartment chosen because the owners were Jews, etc., etc. By the end of the year, 1 week before the Charlie Hebdo and the Hyperkosher attack that would start the terror wave that killed 256 people in 18 months in France and wounded hundreds permanently, the number of anti-Semitic incidents across the country had reached 800, more than 2 a day, for a Jewish population of 500,000 people. Of course, at the time, we did not have the numbers nor the specifics of what was going on, but if you paid attention, the atmosphere was totally palpable in the country. So I decided I would write a series of articles on that, and since there was no French media that would print them, that would even be interested in that subject at the time, I went to New York and I went to Tablet magazine, and that ended up with a book. I started to write the book, which I thought would be a small extension of my coverage for Tablet, three days before the Charlie Hebdo and the Hyperculture attacks, and that, of course, changed everything. It suggested that I had been right. The intuition that had led me to tablet was right, but what exactly was the nature of the intuition was more problematic, because what was the connection between random anti-Semitic incidents, spontaneous rage that would empower basically anyone in the country? What was the relationship between that and a planned terror attack that potentially targeted everyone, not just the Jews? So that question became, in a way, the subject of the book itself. That I wrote it while the terror wave was on, and also while a populist movement was on the rise in France. In 2015, 2016, we all assumed that the next president in 2016 would be François Fillon, who was at the time a bedfellow. He was a pro-Putin candidate, in fact, and his speeches and his electorate prefigures the people that now find their way toward Éric Zemmour. So there was all that. That was the general picture in France in 2015. What I found out, in a nutshell, in the book is that you have a global populist wave that France was the laboratory of in 2015, 2016. And if you see, there's a way to see what we call Islamism as the Muslim the Muslim version of that global populism. It's a more violent version of any of the other kind of populism that we have anywhere else. But still, if you remember that the first Islamist network that were active in France, that set foot in France, were coming from Algeria in the early 90s by way of Kandahar. You begin to understand what that means. In Algeria in the early 90s, in the late 80s and early 90s, Algerians were flew by Saudi's networks to Kandahar to train, and went back to Algeria, where they started a civil war that took 200,000 lives in 10 years, a little bit less than 10 years. Those Salafi-trained terrorists set foot in France in the early 90s. What's interesting is the speech, their propaganda, what they were saying. They were fighting against democracy, liberalism, that they saw as the product of the global empire, American empire, and that they saw liberalism as a mode of decadency that would feminize nationalist culture and religion. So they were pretty much anti-gay, anti-women, anti-democracy, and of course against the Jews. You can find the same rhetoric against decadence in far-right circles, certainly in today's speech by Éric Zemmour in France, even though he's not as murderous as the Islamists were, of course. But still, when you look at if you look for a reason why there was so much complacency in France with the Islamists in 2015, both in the extreme left and the extreme right, you begin to understand there's a connection. There is the same impulse of hate and destruction toward anything that has to do with liberalism. A best-selling author like Virginie Despentes, for instance, who's a novelist and a feminist novelist and a far-left novelist in Paris, claimed her love for the terrorists that killed people at Charlie Hebdo on the ground that they were courageous enough to claim their dignity back by killing people. Éric Zemmour, on the extreme right, claimed that he had admiration for the killers at Charlie Hebdo because he said they were able to do things that we Westerners are not able to do any longer because we've been feminized by liberalism and the West and Western culture. So you begin to see a connection, a sort of dynamic at play in 2015 and 2016, where on the one hand you have the terror networks coming from Algeria, and on the other hand you have far left and far right extremists all united against whatever that was left from the 90s and from the global order. I think basically that's what took place in France. And if you see it this way, France can be seen as the laboratory for what followed, not just in France. I mean, I really thought, when I was writing this book, I really believed that once the book would be written and published, François Fillon would be president in France and the country would just go down the drain, while Hillary Clinton would be president in the US, so I would just, leave France and go to the US. It didn't exactly turn that way. But so what I think is what we faced in France, everybody faces it in one way or another now. This is a global attack against whatever remains of the values that we call liberalism. And the terror and anti-Semitism was just the anti-Semitism was just the most obvious symptom of that, because Jews are rightly or wrongly seen as the symbol of the liberal order and of what we used to call cosmopolitanism. The key phrase for the right wing as well as the Islamists is authenticity. Both fight, and for the extreme left as well, these three currents fight in their own way for a more authentic identity against the miscegenation that is being implemented by international liberalism and general democracy. What they're looking for is, Salafi are looking for an authentic Islamist identity. What remains of the far left is fighting for, of course, identity of the migrants, of the trans, of women, just name anyone you want. And the far right, of course, is fighting for the national authentic cultures that are being threatened by, strangely enough, the liberal order. This is one of the strange things with people like Eric Zemmour now in France. They both advocate for Western order and in a way capitalism. But on the other hand, they fight that order in the name of an authentic identity of the country. You sort of have the same contradiction in the U.S. with people like Bannon, for instance, and people like Bannon and like Zemmour take their source at the same place. There is a current that unites Bannon, Zemmour, and people like Alexander Dugin in Russia, for instance. But both are fighting for purity and for authenticity. So that's what I found out writing the book, and that's all there is to say. We're now in 2021. We're at a crossroad in France. The terror wave have somehow receded. The Salafi network are more quiet, basically because the Saudi politics has changed in the last few years. But the Muslim Brothers are very active in the country today. And of course, the far right is very strong culturally. Whatever happens with Zemmour remains to be seen, but the narrative that he helped bringing back in the center of the country is going to stay for the next few years. That's it.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that presentation. It's a very good book, by the way. It's an excellent book. It's not the lightest book in the world, but it really goes to explain the complexity of this subject in a very useful way. So congratulations on writing a great book. First, let me just say thanks to Josh and the organization for hosting this. There are some of us around the table have been, meaning David Brooks, have been coming for about 20 years intermittently to these conferences. We used to have this conference in this hotel in Key West next to a strip club. Everything in Key West is next to a strip club, so it was impossible to avoid it. So this has really gotten classy, by the way. Yeah, this has really gotten classy in recent years. And we had very good times down there. There was the time the former head of the ACLU tried to explain to Rick Warren why he should become an atheist. That was exciting. The all-night arguments with Christopher Hitchens, which resulted in Christopher Hitchens staying up all night and imbibing too much, and my heroic wife schlepping him back to Washington while I absconded to the Middle East. They were great times, and we hope to have interesting times here too. So thank you, Josh. I took a couple of points off of what you just heard. There's and I guess this will be the main topic, or one of the main topics of a discussion period. But the persistence of anti-Semitism is obviously a subject almost of supernatural qualities and timeless qualities, and you touched on it a little bit in talking about the Jews as the symbol of liberalism. One of the interesting things to me about this is that it's and this is sort of just a spontaneous reaction to something you said, is yes, that is true. To a Dugin in Russia or to a Bannon in America, Jews are the symbol of decadent liberalism. But the nature of anti-Semitism is such is that the Jews can be and have been simultaneously labeled as rootless cosmopolitans and blood and soil nationalists, as Bolsheviks and ultra-capitalists. Jews have been blamed for killing Jesus and also for inventing Christianity. You know, what's interesting is that there's not a lot of us, so we're very busy, obviously. If half of it is true, it's just that we're really working hard. But that's the nature of it is of anti-Semitism is virus is a very good and appropriate way of framing this. The virus finds hosts. The virus finds ways of being carried into the discourse, into society, and it doesn't have to all make sense. As you well know, it's because it's sort of irrefutable in a kind of way. If you were a conspiracy-minded person, well, obviously the Jews invented capitalism, and obviously to another person they invented communism. So I hope we can get into that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, just for a few minutes, about maybe expand the conversation a little bit out of France to Europe more broadly, and I became interested in this subject a number of years ago. It was not because of anti-Semitism that got me interested. I was visiting Rome and was meeting with some of the leaders of the Roman Jewish community, which is a fascinating community. It's only about 15 or 18,000 people. But I made the cardinal mistake one makes when meeting with leaders of Roman Jewry by asking whether the traditions in the synagogues in Rome are Ashkenazi or Sephardic, meaning European-oriented or Middle East-oriented. And Roman Jews, quite rightfully and pridefully, say, Roman Jewry predates the split. Rome has had a Jewish community for 2,200 years or so. And so Roman Jewry is its own pre-split tradition. So it's a fascinating community. Obviously, it exists in the shadow of the Vatican for 1,500 years. But what struck me, the threat to the Roman Jewish community is not anti-Semitism per se, although there's endemic anti-Semitism in Italy, of course. What struck me as so interesting was the demographic challenge to Roman Jewry. I'm not putting a value judgment on anything here when I say that it is very hard for a minority community of 15,000 or so, out of a total Jewish population in Italy of 45,000, to actually survive, to perpetuate itself. And that was the the challenge that they were facing. It's kind of elegiac and sad that in Venice, the home of the first ghetto, where the word ghetto comes from, Venice is basically sort of a Jewish theme park or a Jewish kind of living museum, but the community is too small to actually sustain itself. And so that got me interested in the future of European Jewry more broadly. And then the interest coincided with the period that Marc is talking about, the sort of sudden wave of violent anti-Semitism in France. Now, interestingly or ironically, the French Jewish community, although under more pressure than any other Jewish community in Europe, except in Western Europe at least, except possibly Sweden, the Swedish Jewish community, the French Jewish community has a much greater chance of survival and even flourishing because of the size, because of the numbers. It makes up less than 1% of France, but it's still 500 or 600,000 people, depending on how you count. And that gives it a kind of weight. Britain has the same kind of weight, 300,000 or so. But most of the rest of the communities across Europe are very small. The French, and maybe you could address this in a moment, but the French Jewish community is interesting because it while having size, it doesn't have political power in the way that that would be able to protect itself. What it has is, at least in the modern era, it seems like the fairly vocal support of French political leaders. Manuel Valls was most famous for this, but I think there is an understanding among French leaders, the mainstream parties, at least, that the Jews, the Jewish community, not just in France but everywhere, is sort of the canary in the coal mine of civilization or modernity, and that if the Jews of France decide that France is no longer safe for them, that means that France is no longer safe for modernity and liberalism. And so it's not just a mere human impulse that makes them want to defend the Jewish community. It is an understanding of their own civilization and the threats to the civilization by anti-modern forces. So I started working on this, and I wrote one big piece for The Atlantic and a bunch of other things that really did focus, that wound up focusing on anti-Semitism to a larger degree than I thought, mainly because this is in the period of, I was meeting with Finkelkraut when his TV was on and the Hypercacher. So I ran down to the Hypercacher scene that day, which was obviously a horrible thing, but that sort of focused my mind on the existential threat, the physical threat to Jewish life in France. When I was working on this subject, I quickly came to a very dark place, as one would. And the darkest observation, maybe it's the darkest observation imaginable, which is that the story we tell ourselves about World War II and the Holocaust, that Hitler was defeated, is not actually true. That Hitler, we know, those of you who study Hitler understand that the paramount goal of Hitlerism was the extermination of the Jews. That's why he used rail cars that he could have been using to supply the Eastern Front. He used them instead to move Jews to the death camps. And he more or less succeeded in his goal before the end of the war, before he was defeated. Which is to say that Europe today has very, very few Jews. Europe in 1939 was the world center of Jewry. In 1945, 6 million were gone. And so the genocide was effective in shaping the future and structure of the world Jewish community. In 1939, there were 18 million Jews in the world. Today, there are 16 million. So, the numbers are the numbers. And so I became fascinated by that because not only does it lead to this dark conclusion that genocide actually is effective from the perspective of the people committing the genocide, but because it actually changed the course of Jewish history. After World War II, the Jewish center shifted to America, and now Israel, of course, for the first time in 2,100 years, the majority of the world's Jews live in the land of Israel, which is, again, not something that we've seen for a very long time. So all of Jewish history was changed at a moment's within a short span. I want to be clear in saying, and this is where this kind of discourse from an American becomes offensive to European Jews. I want to say that obviously there will always be Jews in Europe. The question is, will they be sort of tiny communities? Put it this way, there'll always be Jewish museums in Europe. Even cities without Jews have Jewish museums now. But there will always be Jews surviving in Europe in some form. The question is this a meaningful center of Jewish life or not? There are obviously people in German politics and French politics who would like very much for Jewish life to spring back, but it is a demographic challenge, and it of course is a terrorism challenge. I want to, I'm jumping around a little bit because I just want to address a couple of the points that you made. But I want to talk about where European Jewry finds itself. There are about 1.3, 1.4 million Jews in Europe if you include Russia. The challenge in front of European Jews today is very interestingly an echo of the challenge facing Europe's Jews about 120 years ago. There is a feeling, a sad feeling that anti-Semitism cannot and will not be erased from the continent. There was obviously a hope that the Holocaust was a kind of inoculation against anti-Semitism, and it was for many, many years. It made anti-Semitism kind of smelly. It was even among people who had a kind of genteel anti-Semitism to them. Felt like, well, the Holocaust, that was a bit much. And so the Jews had this inoculation for a while. That inoculation has obviously worn off as time passes. And so you find that European Jewish communities are facing the same set of possible responses to their condition that they faced 100 to 120 years ago. 120 years ago, and this is obviously relevant to anyone who is Jewish in America, Britain, Canada, because most of our ancestors came out of Europe 100, 120 years ago. There were four main responses to the existential challenge of being Jewish in Europe in that period at the turn of the 20th century, the late 1890s to the Kishinev pogrom through World War I. The first response on the part of many Jews was to reach the conclusion that in order to be safe as a Jew, the world must change. In order to be safe as a Jew, the world must change. And those people drifted toward communism. They needed a new world order in order to change the world, to erase race, religion, and everything else, and just make it a class struggle. And the Jews were mainly lower class, so they were to benefit from a communist revolution. The second response on the part of some Jews in Europe was to believe that the world would not change, so the Jew must change, and they became Zionists. They said we have to move the Jews out of Europe and change the Jew himself, make the Jew a farmer and a soldier, and take on bodily autonomy in a kind of way. And so that was the second response. Both of these are minority responses within the larger Jewish community. The third response, and this is a response disproportionately found in the most religious elements of the Jewish community then and now, actually, was to pray and hope that things worked out. That's why a disproportionate number of very religious Jews died in the Holocaust, because they were sort of passive in their approach to the coming threat. And the fourth response was, and this was the majority of Jews back then, was just to get the hell out of Dodge, as we say. Which was, luckily, America opened up right around that period. Canada, Argentina, Britain, mainly the United States. And so literally millions of Jews fled when they could, and said, you know what, we're not gonna build new systems, new theoretical governance system. We're just gonna get out and go to a place where it seems they like us just a little bit more. All of those responses remain in some form or fashion today for Jews in Europe and Jews in other places as well. And we can get into the sort of the Israel dynamic versus the diaspora dynamic in a conversation. I just want to make one other point before I turn it over back to Josh. And this gets into the semantics of this conversation. And I'm not anti-Semitic. But Sorry, I can't help it. I can't help it. I had to do it. I had to do it. You know, the Talmud says, "Who is a hero? He who can resist a pun." The Talmud doesn't actually say that. The interesting thing to me about the language that we use around these subjects, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, I would propose, and just because we're having this conversation and I have time to talk about it, anti-Semitism is a terrible term for what we're describing. It's terrible, A, because it was invented by an anti-Semite, a man named Wilhelm Marr, who was a very prominent German anti-Semite of the 1840s, 1850s, I can't remember, who anti-Semitism was a political movement and to introduce science into the hatred of Jews. It was trying to build rationales for the hatred of Jews rather than just say we hate them because they killed Jesus or whatever it is. And so it's a term, it's a euphemistic term invented by an anti-Semite to propagate anti-Semitism. So that kind of gives it a little bit of an odor. The second is that there's no such thing as Semitism, so it's very hard to be anti-Semitic. Semitism is a euphemism for something, I don't know what. I just don't like the euphemistic quality of it, and I prefer to use anti-Jewish hatred or something like that. Not Judeophobia, because hating Judaism or being critical of Judaism as a system of thought is a different thing than actually hating Jewish people. But that's the first term that I think that we should open for discussion generally. The second term is anti-Zionism, which of course plays a big role in what we might agree is anti-Semitism of the extreme left masquerading as anti-Zionism. You know, just by the way, this is not necessarily a dynamic in France, where you have this Islamist extremist overlay to these questions, but in America, at least, the sort of the joke about far left-wing anti-Semitism and far right-wing anti-Semitism is that the difference between right-wing anti-Semites and left-wing anti-Semites is that the right-wing anti-Semites want to kill you, and the left-wing anti-Semites want you to kill yourself. And we could talk about that because it actually is an interesting, and this feeds into anti-Zionism. What left-wing anti-Semites say is, Jews are fine. We just don't think that you deserve a country of your own, and therefore you should leave or go back to Europe or whatever sort of formula they use. I find this also sort of unpleasantly abstract and euphemistic. Zionism was a ideology that believed that the Jews should return to their historic homeland in British Mandatory Palestine, before that Ottoman Palestine. One could argue that Zionism came to an end in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel. The idea was then replaced by this reality, and I'm not commenting on Israeli politics where I find myself actually on the left, but I'm commenting on the question of existence or non-existence. Being anti-Zionist now means that you're not opposed to an idea, you're opposed to the actual, I will use a current expression, lived experience of 7 million Jews who live in a place. Israel's population of 9 million, 7 million of those people are Jewish. So when you say that you're opposed to Zionism as a concept, what you're saying is that these people who've decided that they are Israeli and live in this place don't have a right to be that and do that, and so it becomes a really troublesome expression. It's the difference between Zionism as a concept and a reality is this. I've sometimes said this. You meet a young couple and they're talking about having parenting, whether they be good parents or whether they're ready to be parents, and that is a normal conversation for a young couple to have. It's a completely abnormal conversation if they already have a baby. And so the conversation about anti-Zionism today is held at a level of abstraction that doesn't recognize that Israel exists and there's 7 million Jews there, and you're talking about real lives and real people. And so I find that term inadequate as well. But with that, I'll turn it back to you because there's a million ways we can go down this road.
Okay. Yeah, just a few points on the idea that we all thought that anti-Semitism was behind us in Europe after World War II. I really believe that the second half of the Cold War was the real end of history for Western Europe. We thought that everything was behind us. The lives we had in my teenage time, for instance, was a life where nothing could really happen any longer in Western Europe. Things happened on TV, in Vietnam, in the US. Sometimes if you paid attention, and if you were not a communist like my parents were, in the USSR. But apart from that, nothing happened anymore. We all had the same lives. We were not Jews any longer. We didn't talk so much about Jewishness. My parents never talked about it, certainly. So it came back with an incredible force at the end of the 90s for people of my generation, this notion that things were suddenly not as settled as we thought they were. And we had to face something that we had never thought, we had never imagined we should face one day. We all felt estranged. I mean, certainly all people of my generation that were even remotely Jewish had to face a new feeling of isolation, not just because of Islamist networks. It started in the cultural environment, especially if you were working on the left, as was my case. I was working at the time in a news magazine. I was the chief editor of the literary section of a news magazine that was a leftist one. And you ended up finding yourself totally isolated just because of your name. There were issues that I was not supposed to talk to on paper, and I wasn't supposed to write about. And if I did, it was understood as, of course, you're on the same side as we are. You're pro-Palestinian. You can't be Jewish. I mean, you're not going to let your who you are get into what you write. So whatever I wrote, even when it was not, in fact, necessarily pro-Israeli, it had nothing to do with that. I was just trying to describe what was going on. It was assumed that I was either on the extreme left or I couldn't write at all. So there was this new isolation that was very strange to go through, and it changed my life. Between the fall of the peace process in the Middle East in September 2000 and September 11, where I don't think Americans understand the feeling of unavowed enthusiasm that took place, not just in Paris, I think in many places when September 11 occurred. The feeling was like, at last something's going on. At last history's back, and besides, Americans deserve it for everything they did. It was sometimes plainly phrased. It was sometimes articulated that way, but mostly it was left unsaid. But it was there. You could feel it. I saw people actually rejoicing after September 11, not in Muslim suburbs, in the cultural, in the journalistic and cultural environment in Paris. So there was that, and in the early 2000s, the only thing you could do was to leave, and that's what I did. I first went to Israel and then to the US because I was going crazy in Israel because of the terror wave, and so between the atmosphere in France and the atmosphere in Israel, I just lost it, and so I ended up in the US instead for a while. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that the return of history in Western Europe was tremendously violent and brutal, and we didn't expect it. We didn't expect anything like that at all. When you say that, yeah, that the future of the Jews is in the U.S. or was in the U.S. Basically, that's what you're saying. And I tended to agree for a long, long time. And people of my Jews of my generation certainly looked to the U.S. as a model. We were raised with American Jewish literature, the Sal Bellows, the Philip Roths, the Norman Mailers, and so forth, as a model of being Jewish in a secular way, and also at the same time very Jewish historically, intellectually, and in certain subjectivity. a certain Jewish subjectivity that was very present in their work. So that was very important for us. It was not just Jewish, it was Ashkenazi Jewish. It was the heritage of what had been the heart of Jewishness in Europe until Hitler came up. So for us, it was really something. That's where we would find. That's what nurtured us. That was certainly what nurtured me. Now, is it still the case? Is it still true? Is American Jewry still a model, and is it still as alive as it was in the second half of the century? I wrote a piece in Tablet called The Vanishing to talk about that, and I have serious doubts. I'm not sure at all that Sal Bellow, Philip Roth, or Norman Mailer would be able to publish anything at all in the current atmosphere in the US, for one. And of course, Trump's election also changed a lot of things. I mean, things like what happened in Charlottesville would have been unthinkable 20 or 30, 40 years ago. Certainly the Tree of Life Synagogue was unthinkable for 20 or 30 years ago. So what the first decades of the 21st century taught us is that there is no home any longer, nowhere. And we have to invent a new form of Jewish sensibility that would include that new feeling of exile, I think, regardless of where we're from. There will always be Jews either in the US or in Europe, and to mention France, it's worth asking the question, what kind of Jews? I mean, you can't escape the fact that Eric Zemmour is Jewish. Not only he's Jewish, but he's backed by the Sephardic community in France, the Algerian Jews especially. So there's a series of paradoxes here, because in many ways Zemmour is reintroducing in the French debate ideas and the nationalist narrative that was the fashion in the first decade of the 20th century. We talked of Maurras, Drummond, and all those guys, pre-fascist guys, that really articulated a sort of French fascism at the expense of Jews. And Zemmour is pretty much reintroducing that narrative unchanged, really. He's resurrecting ghosts in France, in the French landscape, and he's doing so with that face. Because it's not just the name or the biography, it's the face. My grandfather's best friend was the model for the Vichy caricatures of the Jews in 1942. And that's exactly Zemmour's face. So you have this face of a ghost, of a Jewish caricature of the Vichy regime coming back, articulating the Vichy narrative in today's France. So that's a strange thing. And it's, the other paradox is that in 1940, the Consistoire, who was the main organization of the Jews in France, was pro-Pétain. It was not that Pétain defended the Jews. It was the Jews, French Jews, were pro-Pétain, and they were turning against the Polish Jews that had recently arrived in France, to the point that they would even create a sort of barrier in synagogues between French Jews and Yiddish-speaking Jews to make a difference. They were pro-Pétain because they were way too assimilated. They wanted assimilation. The paradox today is that Zemmour is reproducing that discourse, that narrative, that because he's backed by Jews that are too religious, they're too communitarist. It's the other way around. They're not assimilated any longer. It's the other way around, but it's the same narrative. So we're facing weird contradictions that I don't really know how to explain, but it's very disconcerting nowadays. But that's the kind of Jews that you find in this country today. That has nothing to do with what we like to remember of what the Yiddishkeit was about, and what the heritage of that Yiddishkeit was in the U.S. in the second half of the 20th century. I'll stop there. But just to add that, yeah, virus is a very good word for whatever you call it, anti-Semitism or Judeophobia or anti-Jew or whatever. I use the word in my book as a homage I'm paying to William Burroughs, but because he was the first to make that equivalence between language and virus, how a narrative can infiltrate and contaminate you. Very recently in France, you had Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of the La France Insoumise, the left-wing movement, who went on TV to accuse Zemmour of being a fascist because he was culturally too Jewish. So there you go. You have the perfect storm, in a way, the perfect trap. On the one hand, this Jewish fascist that is Eric Zemmour, and on the other hand, a left-wing guy saying that Zemmour is fascist because he's a Jew. So there you go. That's the virus, you know.
I think that point you made about finally history's going on, it's been so slow, it's been so boring, it's been dilating on that environment, just like the rise of Islam in the prisons in the United States, Christianity in the prisons in the United States, people groups at large where the language of virus that Jeff used can set in is intriguing to consider as part of this larger conversation. Maybe one more from Jeff, and then let's go to the group.
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually have a question for Marc about something he said, but just to respond to is America still a safe place for Jews? Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, possibly this is just America-centrism on my part, but even given the Tree of Life synagogue shooting and the way the far right thinks about Jews, and for that matter, the far left thinks about Jews, because obviously the one thing we know across continents that the far left and far right always find a way to agree on is that somehow the Jews are a problem, which is why, you know, in an internet-run age where centrism and moderation are under threat, it's generally speaking not a good age for Jews anywhere. All that being said, maybe, again, this is America-centric, but I tend to think that the experience in America is still fundamentally different for American Jews than Jews in Europe. But, you know, it's also, you talk about a return to history. The stresses and strains that Jews are facing around the world is just a return to the norm. You know, many young American Jews in particular have been on a kind of holiday from history, and they assume that the experience of Jews in America from the 60s forward is the norm, when it actually, of course, is not the norm at all. So I'm open to your pessimism about the future of American Jewry, but I don't think we're, for many reasons having to do with American culture, the Constitution, the size of the American Jewish community, the assertiveness of the American Jewish community, and so on. I don't think we're there yet. But the question, or maybe you can just dilate on this, because it's another interesting aspect of your book. One of the things that I learned from the book is that it is not the attacks, the various attacks, the Brussels Jewish Museum, Hyper Kasher, Toulouse, the school in Toulouse. These were understood in the sort of oversimplifying way that journalism sort of, you know, produces. These are understood as kind of ISIS attack, Islamist attacks, in a very kind of clear-cut way. And what you argue is that there's something more complicated going on about the decay of French society, or the sort of breakdowns of family, or the collision between modernity and tradition, and the isolation that some young men find. You did it in a smart way, in the sense that you didn't sort of blame France itself, the French government, or for the acts of individuals, but you said you placed it in a kind of you placed it in a context where there's something corroding French society. I mean, I was wondering if you could just talk about that for a minute, because it's much more interesting than just saying ISIS decided to go shoot up a Jewish school.
I think, that's what I said in the beginning. The terror wave was preceded with a series of random attacks that were spontaneous. And it was really like an epidemic of rage that you can't explain rationally. You can't just explain it by Islamist propaganda. Something else is going on.
But what is the source of the Encoe rage? the suburbs.
That's the. Of course, there is the social element. Of course, there is the post-colonial culture, but even that is more complex than we usually think. First of all, the situation in the suburbs, and what we call the cité in France, it has no equivalent anywhere. It's a mix of social issues and post-colonial history. But to grasp that post-colonial thing currently, you have to remember that if the French governments during the prosperity decades had been willing to integrate, to build up a policy of integration, an aggressive policy of integration of the migrant families in the 60s and the 70s, they would have faced opposition from the governments in Maghreb. The FLN in Algeria, the Moroccan king certainly would have stepped against such policy. So you have to remember that after the empire was over, the deals between the French governments and the new powers in Algeria and Morocco was both an economic deal, so the French could have access to gas and oil, and a deal on migrants, that the migrant population coming from those countries to France to work would be under surveillance of both the French police, and the secret police of Algeria and Morocco. If you don't understand that, you understand nothing of what happened afterwards. Because the key thing is that migrants were never able to develop an autonomous life in France. They were never able to develop a culture of migration. They were always kept in chains by their governments of origin as much as they were kept in marginal corners of French society by France. What happened in those migrant families was that the fathers never, mostly those are very patriarchal families, so the father position is central, and the fathers would never explain to their children, sometimes would never acknowledge that they were here in France to stay. They were entertained the notion they would come back and that their children were not really French, and they couldn't be French because it was a humiliation. It was a double humiliation. As an Algerian, especially if you had fought the French colonists, you couldn't admit that unless you would become a traitor. You would become like the Harkis that had fought for the French and were living miserable lives in some corners of French society. So you had to keep your honor safe and pretend that someday you would come back. And anyway, your children were not really part of the country. The way you did that was to remain silent. You just didn't. No issues were raised in families, in Muslim families in the 70s about who you belonged to, whether you were a Muslim or you were not. And the paradox is that in the early 80s, when the young kids began to take the street in a kind of civil rights movement in France to get more integration in French society with what's known as the Marche des Beurs and all that, the feedback of that movement, for integration, was to bring the questions back to the family table. And the young kids came back from the street, from the demonstration, began to ask their parents, what are we? Are we French? Aren't we French? And are we Muslims? Are we not Muslims? And the parents were not able to answer. That was the beginning. That was the root of the disease, if you will. And it became more toxic because of course, the French government was not able to provide the right answer to those kids. And again, one of the reasons why they were not able to bring the right answers was that the left was in power, the socialists were in power. They had very good relationship with the FLN in Algeria, who was a socialist country. And some of the ministers of the French government had actually fought with the FLN 20 years sooner for the independence of Algeria. So they were not ready to acknowledge that first, the FLN was totally corrupt. Second, Algeria was not a democratic country. And third, they should help those kids to divorce from their countries of origin and become fully French. So this toxic dynamic is really, in my mind, it's a dynamic where left-wing ideology, misconstructed social concern, and demagoguery go together and blur the whole landscape. And by the end of the 80s, the young kids that had demonstrated earlier in the decade were totally lost. And that's exactly when the Islamists began to set foot in the country between 1989 and 1991, when the Algerian Civil War began on the other side of the Mediterranean. So that, in a nutshell, that's what took place. The level of resentment, and to that, of course, you have to add the economic crisis in France, the fall of the middle class narrative more than the middle class itself. It's the middle class narrative that really fell apart somewhere in the 80s, and the left that had been the voice of the middle class during the 60s and the 70s just abandoned it and adopted the language of neoliberalism in the mid-80s. So all that together coalesced during the 80s and the early 90s to help, on the one hand, the rise of the National Front, and on the other hand, the resentment of the young kids in the Muslim suburbs that were ready for Islamist propaganda.
You guys have given us a great deal already. I suggest maybe we turn to the group for a half an hour, and then we'll take a little break and then come back. Just a reminder, there's coffee outside to the left, there's restrooms to the back to the right. And when you ask a question, if you wouldn't mind pressing the button and then pressing the button again to turn it off, that would be grateful. Let's start with Ed Luce from the Financial Times, and we'll work our way. Let's start with Anne Elizabeth Moutet.
Yes, that should be it. I was fascinated, but I expected to be fascinated by Marc's presentation, for one thing because it's my country, and for the other because it brings incredible sort of new light on the causality, the chain of causality that created the problem. One thing, but that's not my only question, was to say, and to further what you just have been saying, which is that at the very time when the young Algerians in France, mostly Algerians, but some Moroccans were asking questions, the French left-wing government of François Mitterrand was beginning to separate them from French society by changing the notion of assimilation into the notion of integration. And they created, for completely electoral reasons, a number of movements, including the Touche pas à mon pote, which was very cynically dreamt up by Julien Drey and his crowd, one of the socialist satraps and his crowd. So that just at the time when the question was being asked, and I didn't realize but I knew that the French Muslim community was watched by the respective secret polices of their own countries. I hadn't sort of connected it, and I think the connection that Marc makes is really very important. That the objectivization, if you will, the essentialization of the young Muslims was actually made at the very same time by the left. And that's, it was, to some extent, it was before it happened in America. And like everything else, you brew it in France and then it sort of develops in sort of strange and fascinating ways in America. That's one thing. The other thing that I would say about the end of history, the vision in France that history would never end was something that was seen as almost a sort of the idea that was the end of history. The notion of the end of history was something that the French took as something that was almost a narcissistic wound, I would say. But I'm very curious on an anecdotal point of view to know which French magazine were sort of not giving you the same not having the same attitude to you just because of your
you want to
name.
know that?
What?
Les Inrecuptibles. I was working at Les Inrecuptibles.
Oh, that was not only that was the French Rolling Stone, basically. Yes, that's really interesting because it was also hip. So that's. What I'd like to know is, I would like at one stage for us to address the fact that at the end of a very long tradition of Jews being mostly on the left, Republican left, center left, extreme left, they now feel safer with the right. And I would posit that's one of the reasons why there is this sort of a natural attraction for Éric Zemmour among part of the Jews. But it's a question that also exists in America. You have lots of Jews who are Trumpistas, and not only because of Israel. That's something that we see in other places, about Eastern Europe. That's really a question that I would ask. Why do Jews now feel more safer on the right?
Should I answer? There are various points on populism and anti-modernism, and France being like the place where all those things are born. To finish on what I was saying, previously I just gave the historical social reasons of the present situation as I see them, but behind all that, there is the French, the French energy that has been populist and anti-modern almost since the aftermath of the French Revolution. We literally invented populism in this country. We invented the moral collective rage, So there is, I think it's really the basis of everything else. When we don't know where to turn, we turn to the riot as the redeeming force that will solve every problem. So this is what unites the Islamist rage and the extreme left rage and the extreme right rage as well. As for the why do Jews go on the right, there are many answers. I mean, the obvious answer is the evolution of the left everywhere. Jeff told about the anti-Zionism and the evolution of the left since in the last 20 years, probably. The paradox is that the peace process of the 90s was praised by the left, that didn't seem to realize that it was basically a liberal project. It was a capitalist. It was under the under logic of it all was was globalization. And when it fell apart, the left suddenly realized that globalization was bad, and that the peace process hadn't been great to begin with, and that the only solution was to be anti-Zionist. That said, I don't think at all that the attraction of the Jews for Éric Zemmour is just standing on a disappointment with the left. First of all, the Sephardic Jews have always been on the right. They didn't wait for the left to change to be on the right. There's a lot of resentment, a lot of unspoken rage because they were thrown out of Algeria in 1962. They hate the Muslims, and they don't have the same historical memory toward the Shoah. They don't really care about the Shoah, if truth being told. They don't think that, because a lot of them are religious also, there is this tendency to believe that Hitler came because Jews were too assimilated in Europe, they were not good Jews, and somehow it's God's will. So there is that among Sephardis. It's there. So they don't really. The Shoah is not supposed to be their problem. What their problem is that they hate against the Muslims, and they don't even care when Zemmour talks about the children that were killed at the Ozar HaTorah school as non-French. They don't really, when he insults Jews, when he insults the victims, when he says derogatory things against Sandler, who was the father of the grandfather of some of the children that were killed there, they don't even care about that. So, you can't explain that just because of the disappointment toward with the left. It's I don't know what these guys have in mind, but they just like the way Zemmour speaks when he speaks a fascist discourse. That's it. In that way, I think it's very different of the Jews voting Trump, for instance, because it's not the same past, there is not the same background, and Trump is not Jewish, and so it's. I'm not sure you can compare really the evolution of the French Jews.
I just add one thing, just in the American context at least. I don't want to overstate Jews fleeing to the right in the American context. I mean, one of the many differences between Benjamin Netanyahu and Barack Obama is that Barack Obama always got the majority of the Jewish vote. Netanyahu never broke 25% of the Jewish vote in Israel. And so you see every 4 years there's the journalistic trope is this the election where the Jews move to the right? And the Republican Party usually does between 20 and 30% of the Jewish vote. Nothing really ever changes. Reagan was a high point, I think. So I don't want to overstate it. All that being said, the interesting thing about France is how much it relates, this electoral dynamic relates to the electoral dynamic in Israel. The majority of Jews in Israel are refugees from Arab countries or descendants of refugees from Arab countries. The Ashkenazi elite of Tel Aviv believes that these poor Sephardim, the Mizrahim, the Jews of the East, literally is what Mizrahim means, are operating or laboring under this false consciousness that the left is not good for them. The classic sort of there's a level of condescension built into that relationship. The Sephardim, as refugees from Arab countries where they were from which they were expelled, believe that the right in Israel has the answers for them. It's very similar to, let's say, the Jews of Sarcelles as opposed to the Jews of Central Paris or something. Where they're living next door to gangs that have been infected by the virus. Whether they're not ISIS, they're not this, they're not that, but they've been infected by this virus, and so they vote their immediate interests. I mean, every country obviously there's a different electoral dynamic, but I think in the French example is very interesting because it so closely mirrors what happens in Israeli voting patterns.
Yes, they're more Middle Eastern. Also, the geographical. Most of these guys have families in Israel since the early '60s. They left the Arab countries, and some of them went straight to Israel. Others came to France. It's only 4 hours away from Paris, Israel, and so there's a proximity, and so the political landscape. Their political view is somehow shaped more by what's going on in Israel than anywhere else, I guess.
Okay, on the list we have Ed Luce, Carolina Vigera from Poland, Shadi Hamid, Katrin Benhold, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Simon Cooper, and Vincent Ugo. So let's keep it going. Ed Luce, you're up.
I'll be brief in that case. One example, Jeff, of where the Jewish vote has moved from the left to the right is Britain. And that's been quite marked. And I noticed neither of you discussed Jeremy Corbyn at all in your very interesting remarks.
It's a nice sunny day out. Do we really?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ruin your sunny day and ask you to. But and also as to whether that the anti-Zionism of Corbyn, is related to what you were Mark experiencing, during French media coverage of what was happening in Israel, this idea that you have to be pro-Palestinian, otherwise you're not on the left. I mean, Corbyn would say, I'm anti-racist. Therefore, how could I possibly be anti-Semitic? I think hearing you tease out the contradictions there would be very interesting, and whether you were surprised to see the Labour Party completely captured by this. And the second question I have is, and the final one, is neither of you mentioned the role of Israeli populism and of Netanyahu.
What populism?
Israeli populism and Netanyahu, and the fact that overt, or at least deeply implicit, anti-Semite populist leaders elsewhere, such as Viktor Orban, have really seen Netanyahu as a pioneer in some respects of the electoral methods that they've then sort of imported. That there are links between, the Israeli right, or at least his part of the Likud party, and parties that are anti-Semitic across the West, and it's a very odd, very troubling sort of symbiosis that I'd love to hear both of you comment on.
I mean, on that one, we spend all day on that one sentence answer to that is that, where you stand depends on where you sit, or where you sit depends on where you stand. I never remember which one it is. Israeli Jews are different than diaspora Jews. They grew up and live with the Jewish majority. In that sense, it's a normal country and a normal experience. And so you're going to have right-wing politics and left-wing politics, and the right-wing politicians are going to find common cause with other right-wing politicians like themselves. Yes, it seems historic. The strangest aspect of everything that's going on at the moment is the rise of an Algerian Jew, Eric Zemmour, as a Vichy apologist fascist in French politics. That's a hard one for even the screenwriters, right? But it is historically ironic, and there are a lot of people in Israel who loathe Netanyahu for this alone. It's Orban is an heir to a Hungarian fascist tradition that obviously is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews, Hungary, and so. But it also goes back to it's a kind of realpolitik. You can explain it with realpolitik in a way. It's what Menachem Begin said, when he was criticized for building the first alliance between evangelical Christians and Israel in America in the 70s and 80s. He said, somebody said to him, he said, but they believe that you're going to go to hell. And Begin's answer was, well, meanwhile, they can help on Capitol Hill. Which is like very, fine. We'll find out, won't we? But in the meantime, I'll take the help. And so Netanyahu was simply saying, well, Hungary will vote with me in the UN, where it doesn't have many votes, and so on. On Corbyn, we don't have anything like Corbyn in the United States. It's very hard for me to sort of find the analog. If we did have a Corbyn in the United States, I would bet that the Republican Party would finally break through and hit 50 or 60% of the Jewish vote. There's this, there's the analog to, the Jewish analog to the Supreme Court notion that you can't define pornography, but you know it when you see it. It's with Corbyn, that's not anti-Zionism, or that's not criticism of Israel. That smells like something else, and you just develop a sense for what that is. The argument that, he's being criticized for being critical of Israel. Everybody's critical of Israel. It's the #1 political sport in the world. That's fine, whatever. It's just the nature of the thing. There's something else going on there that's interesting. I'd also note that line of thinking was ultimately refuted within the Labour Party, and so I think the Jewish community in Britain is breathing a little bit easier now. They saw that even the Labourites themselves understood, wait a second, gone a little too far. But I don't have like special insight into British Jewish voting dynamics.
Very quickly, I think you're right about Netanyahu's populism. He profited of the populist atmosphere, the murderous atmosphere, in the wake of the murder of Yitzhak Rabin back in the 90s, and that never left the country. And it may have an influence on the state of mind of the Sephardi Jews in France, who love him. Something changed in Israel's general atmosphere as something changed everywhere else. And the rampant brutality of Israeli politics, it's never been an easy country, but in the last decades or so, it really became brutish, and Netanyahu never went shy from that, and it has an influence on what's going on, even in the diaspora, probably among Sephardi Jews here, yeah. As for Corbyn, I have nothing to say of Corbyn. I don't know English politics enough, but we do have the equivalent of that here, of course, with Mélenchon and others, and more broadly, with the clientelism of politicians on the left toward the Muslim electorate. It's a clientelism that is fueled by the propaganda of the Muslim Brothers, especially, and it has weird consequences on the political landscape here. I remember when I was writing the book, I went to in a Lyon suburb to interview a mayor that just after an electoral campaign, and on the wall there was this sign: Socialist Party equal Zionists. It was very weird. It was an inscription made by the communists of the previous municipality, of the previous municipal team, to attract Muslim voters. That same municipal team had invited Dieudonné, the comedian I was talking about, the black guy who went across the country with Holocaust deniers in the 2000s. They had invited him to speak and to do his show for the Muslim kids there. So the anti-Zionism in the name of the left is being used here, not just in various ways, not just to gain voters, yes, to get voters, but also to criticize other parties of the left, like the socialists in that case. So it's very messy, but yeah. So,
Okay, welcome back. First up is Karolina Wigera from Poland, followed by Emma Tucker, Shadi Hamid, Katrin Ben-Hold, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Simon Cooper, and Vincent Hugo, and we'll mix it around a little bit if we can, but Katerina.
Yeah, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. And whilst listening to you both, I couldn't help but thinking about what was mirrored by those developments in my country and also in Eastern Europe. Namely that in 2015, the populist government basically established itself, won, because of an anti-Islamic campaign that they organized as a reaction to the refugee crisis in Europe. But then in 2018, when we had the 50th anniversary of the so-called Polish March, the Polish March in 1968 was something completely different than the rest of Europe had, namely instead of youth demonstration, we had an anti-Semitic campaign, and Poland expelled many Jews that survived the war. So this was in 1968, and in 2018, during the anniversary, instead of a commemoration, we actually had a wave of anti-Semitic statements coming from government journalists. So it was very painful. Also because it seemed to revert a certain process of dealing with Polish-Jewish relations that started with Jan Tomasz Gross's publications in 2000 and later. But whilst listening to you, I was also thinking all the time about the social role that such anti-Semitic statements and programs are actually playing. I couldn't help but thinking about René Girard and his scapegoat mechanism, when he says that whenever a certain turmoil takes place in a society, and whenever a certain change, a very deep change, is taking place in a society, then the mechanism of the scapegoat appears again. And it seems that it also plays an important social role, namely that if people are unable to solve the problems where they are dealing with, they try to de-differentiate, as he says. So they try to regain safety by choosing a scapegoat. And so the question about anti-Semitism in France and also in other European countries is, what is the role of it? The neurobiologists often say that if there is a pathological mechanism in our brain, you cannot eradicate it unless you understand what role it serves. What is being done by this mechanism? Why, in other words, the voters of Mr. Zemmour, for example, they are so much in favor of him? What needs does he fulfill that are not fulfilled by the other politicians who are more liberal?
You want to answer that?
No, go ahead.
Okay. To answer simply, it provides a Professor David Nierenberg, in his book Anti-Judaism, says that anti-Judaism and later anti-Semitism is the only form of hatred that's also an epistemology. It provides answer. It's a mode of knowledge. When you're lost, you're looking for answers, and the answers of the Jews being responsible for what's wrong is going back at least to the French Revolution. Joseph de Maistre and others wondering what had happened to the normal order of things needed an answer that would be of metaphysical order. The answer was the devil, and the legions of the devil were the Jews, the Freemasons, and the Protestants in that case. Today, you have something a little bit similar. Yeah, as I said, anti-Semitism is a form of knowledge. It provides a key to figure out what's going on. When you look at Torrent's manifesto, the killer of New Zealand, for instance, he killed Muslims, but in his manifesto, he explains that he has nothing against Muslims per se. He has something against migrants and the people that are using migrants to impose their orders on the world. And those people in his manifesto are the Jews. So even though he killed Muslims, the enemy is the Jew. You can find that pretty much anywhere among these Islamists today, and among what I call post-fascist forces in Europe. After 45, and I'll stop here. But after 45, the extreme right networks gathered in Belgium, in France, and elsewhere in Italy, and defined a new analysis according which Europe was occupied, not by the Nazis who had just been defeated, but by the Americans. That wanted to impose and international bankers. In their minds, of course, these bankers were Jewish also. And by the 70s, this logic had driven them to look for new alliances. And by the 80s, these new alliances would be between former fascists and former communists and former fascists and Islamists. So that the new rights, for instance, in France always advocated for an alliance with the Iranians under the same argument that you have to destroy the people that manipulate the world order, and those people are the Jews. So basically, in a nutshell, yeah, what this explanation provides, what this hatred provides is an explanation for what's wrong in the world. And why the Jews? Because, as we were discussing that during the break, it's the plasticity of the Jews that's a problem. You never know with these guys who they are. You know, as Jeff said in the beginning, they can be capitalists, they can be communists, they can be whatever, everything basically, and they're still Jewish. How do they do that? Something's wrong with these guys. The plasticity has become synonymous with modernity, because modern identity is being something and something else, and that's what Jews are since the Maranoes, at least. At every step of the way, every step of modernity, Jews were central in defining modernity and being hated for that. The Maranoes in Spain in the 15th century, the Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and today. That's it, and we need to be short.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, it's anti-Semitism is sort of the first meme in a kind of way. I mean, it's meme ready. And so there's a whole system of thought that you can just plug into. You can self-radicalize on anti-Semitism overnight now, thanks to the web, right? And it is an epistemological phenomenon in the sense that when, to use the American expression, when you can red pill on anti-Semitism almost instantaneously, and an entire world opens up to you. It explains. I mean, look, the external, self-criticism is hard. Externalization of blame is easy. And when the memes are there for you, when the explanation, when a whole world of thought developed over hundreds, if not thousands of years, is there and ready, it becomes very tempting. You know, it's just. I guess we're just lucky, you know, that we're the meme, you know, and it really has to do with the strength of individual societies. Conspiracism is powerful in weak societies, and conspiracism, obviously, going back way further than the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, obviously is focused on the Jews as the secret possessors of power. And I mean, it's what the Nazis believed that they were up against, the world's most powerful military machine believed they were up against a superior force in the form of world Jewry, with an existential crisis that had to be solved by defeating this more powerful force. It's insane, but there you have it. The one other thought I would have, sorry, I know you want to move quickly, but I remember thinking about this on January 6th, last year of this year. I went to the rally outside the White House and the march down, and I walked down to the Capitol with a bunch of QAnon people, and they have this slogan that it's the first time I heard this in the wild, actually. They mutter the words, "The Goyim know," "the Goyim know." It's really interesting, and what they're signaling is that they are woke to the power of the Jews. The Goyim know means that the secret of the Jews has been revealed to them, right? And that they, the Goyim, you know, the non-Jews, now understand everything. And so it's this totalizing little meme, right? It basically says, we're onto you. And once you move yourself into the Goyim know posture, everything becomes clear. Everything that troubles you about the way society is organized, your own economic condition, your own social condition, whether you're successful at dating or not, you know, is explained then through the pernicious behavior of the Jews. And you are among the few, the elect, who have been given the secret knowledge of Jewish power. But the Goyim know. Look for this on the web. It's interesting. It's a very interesting, dark kind of concept.
And I would just add one sentence. According to polls, 44% of the yellow vests, the gilets jaunes, for instance, believe in a Jewish conspiracy, against 22% for the general population in France. That says something. You know, it's one of the problems how to fight that, because it comes up out of nowhere for no discernible reason. So every time you try to denounce anti-Semitism, people go, "What are you talking about?" You know, the yellow vests are fighting the prices of oil. So what are you talking about? Nobody asks, what are they talking about? You know, these people who believe in a Jewish conspiracy. It's you who's absurd because you're raising a question that shouldn't be raised. And in fact, it's true. It comes as an absurd thing, but also an inescapable thing in a way.
Let's go next, please, to Thomas Chatterton Williams with Harper's, who I believe sat on the committee that gave the American Library in Paris Book Award.
Absolutely.
So you guys should meet.
Very impressed with this book, although the American Library in Paris was a little bit uncomfortable with the title.
Carolina, would you mind grabbing that mic for Thomas as well?
Promote hate. Oh, sorry. But
The feel-good book of the summer.
yeah, I've left Harper's and I've joined Jeff at the Atlantic now. So I didn't update my
We'll get it fixed
my
by
piece
lunch.
of paper.
You can hand it over. I'll just scroll on it. It's fine.
But I have a quick question. I was wondering if you could help me sort out a little bit more. And you said it's a paradox and it's a contradiction. It doesn't make sense. But what is the more gaining by playing with relitigating Dreyfus or talking about Vichy now? I mean, aren't there ways that he could outflank Le Pen to the right without trafficking in anti-Semitism?
That's a very good question. It's not anti-Semitism per se that interests him more, I think. It's if you want to unite, you have to understand that in the frame of the post-Cold War world. For decades after World War II, the two pillars of French political identity were Gaullism on the one hand and some form of socialism or communism on the other hand. One was dealing with the political economical order, and the other with the cultural field. This went on. Both those forces really built up the French narrative that France was still a great country, that was blah, 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 and that there was a strong central state ruling things. After 1989, those two narratives collapsed. They were no longer, they lost their, they were no longer useful to describe what was going on. Gaullism and socialism were both ideologies from the Cold War that made sense inside of the Cold War. After Gaullism disappeared, in a way, after socialism disappeared, people went back to a form of pre-Marxist utopist ideology on the left, and something very similar happens to the right. Gaullism was the force that drove the right to democracy in the 30s and 40s in France. Up until that point, the right was tremendously unrepublican. Maurras was the largest spokesperson for the right in general in France. It was the major. People don't realize how strong that current was. L'Action Française was in the 20s and in the 30s in this country. De Gaulle really, although most of the Gaullists were also from the right and had been shaped intellectually by Maurras, partly because they were fighting Nazism and partly because of the Jewish influence of people like Mendes France that joined de Gaulle in London soon enough. Gaullism turned out to become a democratic force, and after World War II, as the Pétain forces were totally discredited in the country, Gaullism really redeemed the right and made the right a democratic modern force during the whole duration of the Cold War. Once Gaullism was out in the 90s, those pre-war forces began to re-emerge, but you had a problem, which was anti-Semitism in the Vichy regime. How do you go back to Maurras without, how do you redeem Maurras from his anti-Semitism? So the extreme right or even reactionary forces in France had a problem with that. What saved them in a way was Islamism. Since the Islamists were openly anti-Semitic, the right became turned to a very good example. You wrote about him, so you understand. Renaud Camus, for instance, you wrote a profile on him in the New Yorker some years back. Renaud Camus, his first targets were the Jews. I was the one who exposed him in France in 2000 because he was writing against the Jews openly in his journal. After 2000, after 2001 especially, he became an ardent defender of Israel, and his main target became the Muslims. That was general in France. It was the general tendency of the very reactionary thinkers to suddenly defend Israel and go against the Muslims. But then it was not enough. There was always a contradiction among the extreme right on how do you regard Israel. Darquet de Pellepoix, who was the High Commissioner in the Jewish affairs during World War II in the Pétain regime, gave a famous interview in 1978 in L'Express, in which he said that in Auschwitz, only the Lises were gassed. And in the same, les poux, and in the same interview, he claimed his admiration for the Israeli army. In the same interview. So there was this paradox among the extreme right, And anyway, what happened after the Cold War was over by the early 2000s was a tendency to let's try to reconcile our secret admiration for Maurras and our defense of Israel against the Muslims And actually, if you have a Mauritian view of Israel as the country where, one people, one land, this is the rhetoric of Maurras. And if you see Israel that way, you can be at the same time a fascist, a French fascist, and a defender of Israel. The only problem is, what do you do with Vichy? That's where Zemmour enters the picture. He provides the perfect speech and the perfect figure to reconcile yourself with that past. I'm Jewish. I think Vichy was great. I think there's no difference between Pétain and de Gaulle. And so we're all a great family again, That's so all this to say that if you want to unite the right, it's also a political calculation. If you want to get the far-right electorate, if you're a right-wing candidate, you have somehow to go through Vichy. There's no way out of that. So paradoxically enough, the Jewish past is central in the politics in France today because of that past. That's why I believe that somehow Zemmour is paving the way for someone else. Either he knows it or not, I don't know, but he won't be elected, but what he's accomplishing in France today, this reconciliation between of the right with its own past, will allow another candidate in 5 years from now to make a very radical campaign, and he will be much more serious than Zemmour is.
Let's go sobering to Emma Tucker with the Sunday Times, unless you're working for the Atlantic now.
Thanks, Josh. So I wanted to ask you, Marc, you paint a very, very bleak picture, and I don't doubt it for 1 second, but who, if anyone, you do have the support of mainstream political leaders in France, but who at a national level is doing anything to push back?
And can you speak a bit?
Oh, sorry, who's doing anything to push back? I mean, Ed made the point about the Labour Party. They rooted out. They took the anti-Semitism really seriously eventually because they knew that if they didn't do anything about it, they were finished as a political party. So they did this report and they kicked out anti-Semites. Surely somebody in France at a national level is doing something about it, is pushing back, is saying, we've got a problem with anti-Semitism, what are we doing about it? And if, I'd like to know who they are and what they're doing. And then just a really quick question that maybe Jeff could answer. Do you agree with Marc that Saul Bellow, Philip Roth et al. Wouldn't get published these days? My view on that is if they didn't get published, they wouldn't get published now, not because of anything they wrote about being Jewish, but because of the way they wrote about women.
Well,
you go first while I think about that.
Okay. Well, the answer on anti-Semitism is who's doing the pushback. As Jeff said, the government is pretty much aware of the problem now, but the government has two problems. One is that doing a serious pushback on anti-Semitism would mean to be very firm against Islamist lobby in France, and there you have the problem, the geopolitical problem. For years, going against Islamists is to go against Qatar. Going against the Salafis, going against the Saudis. You need those guys. You need them financially. Who financed the Libyan war, for instance? What was the role of the Qatar in the financing of the Libyan war on the French side? Things like that. Macron realized that with Erdogan he has a real problem, and last year it was very clear that Macron's adoption of a firmer policy against Islamist networks in France has a lot to do with the conflict with Erdogan and Erdogan's offensive in the Middle East and against Europe in general. So there is this geopolitical aspect that makes it very difficult for a government in France to really implement a coherent policy. The other point, and that's a deeper point, is the fact that the problem we're having is that this anti-Semitism is coming from the down top and not from the top down. So the more a government is doing something for the Jews, the more what he does, what he appears to be doing, is fueling the notion that Jews have special protection, and therefore it nurtures anti-Semitism by the very way it tries to fight it. So you're fucked.
We'll edit that just mildly. Just kidding.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. We got an explicit rating.
Okay. As for Salbello, Philip Roth, and others, let Jeff answer. But I have something to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, they would get published. There's a lot of publishers in America. They'd probably be popular. What they wouldn't be is understood as being the central interpreters of the post-war American experience. You know, I think that baton has been passed, but I think they'd be published.
They're probably, I guess they would, but it's a. I mean, look at what happened when the biography, Roth's biography, came out. I mean, the guy is what he is, but still, it's interesting. You know, the way Philip was connected with these guys, and you know, it appeared to be like a natural thing. You know, if this guy is a rapist, well, no question. You know, he's Philip Roth's biographer. What did you expect? So there's this whole thing going on right now in America. It's not directly connected with the Jewish experience, but it's still somehow it is. Because the Jewish rise and the world after World War II in the U.S. had a lot to do with a certain extreme freedom of speech and provocative thing. I mean, Lenny Bruce, people like that. But it's connected. The energy of that period is somehow gone, and so maybe they would be published, but their careers would be very different, I would say.
Yeah, Molly, that's my point.
Just going to interject the point that Saul Bellows' son is a top right-wing publisher in the United States.
Absolutely.
So the father would find a way. But I mean, you know, it's an interesting question because it's sort of like a presentist kind of argument. I mean, Bellow and Roth wouldn't be Bellow and Roth today anyway. I mean, they were of their time, and there's some new feelings, and you know, their writing is luminous and will last forever because of the quality of their writing. But their attitudes about women, let's say, and I think it cuts along that dimension more than anything else.
And Norman Mailer.
You know, would be troublesome. But I don't think it's a Jewish question. I think it's more a misogyny question.
Let's go to Shadi Hamid with Brookings and Wisdom of Crowds and Atlantic, and maybe now Fuller.
Okay, yeah. So this was alluded to in the conversation in various ways, but I think what's one really interesting development, if you look at right-wing populist movements, is that they, instead of being avowedly anti-liberal, at least in some countries, they're presenting themselves as defenders of the liberal tradition. I think of the PVV in the Netherlands, Swedish Democrats, Danish People's Party, but also to some extent Marine Le Pen, who is saying that Muslims are a threat against the Enlightenment gains of Europe, so on gay rights, sexual freedom, also portraying herself as a defender of the Jewish minority, in some sense against Muslims. So what you're seeing is this kind of wedge situation where right-wing populists are using the threat of Muslims to basically say we are liberals in a somewhat counterintuitive and paradoxical way, and I think that I just wonder what this says more broadly about how relationships between the Jewish minority and the Muslim minority in Europe will evolve, because if Muslims are a wedge issue and in some sense Jews are a wedge issue and they're being kind of pushed against each other in a way. As you said, increasingly Jews are finding themselves on the right of the political spectrum and Muslims generally are finding themselves on the left of the political spectrum. That's not that's somewhat unfortunate that this cleavage is also a partisan cleavage, if you will, which is very different than, say, the US, where, until now, Muslims and Jews are still key members of the Democratic Party's coalition. I think that'll stay for the foreseeable future, although people are trying to change that. But it's just striking to me that this is the U.S., and not to say that the U.S. is awesome in every way, but I think it is somewhat positive that you see that in the U.S., but you see something very different developing in Europe. And this could become a bigger problem as Muslims become a bigger percentage of the population in Europe. And there was that Pew demographic study where they had different projections of the numbers of Muslims there would be in 2050. And with the medium projection, which I guess is the most likely one, Sweden will be 20% Muslim by 2050. I think France, it's something like 15%. And I would just be curious what your reflections are, both of you really, on what this means for Muslim-Jewish relations, especially as the Muslim population grows to such an extent, and if Muslims are seen as enemies of liberalism, and then the fear of Muslims is used to basically say, well, we have to, in some sense, limit the influence of Muslims if we want to stay liberal on women's rights, on protection of the Jewish minority, sexual freedom, so on and so forth.
Very quickly, I often wonder about the way Jews and Muslims are pitted against each other in this sense, especially, if you believe that the nature of, let's say if you have an acerbic view of European populism, sort of right-wing populism, reminds me of what's that joke about, I can't believe that the leader of the leopards eating my face party just ate my face. Eventually the populists are going to remember that they hate Jews also. Right now they have Muslims to hate. And so opportunistically they're using the Jewish population to buttress their own claims, not only of liberalism, but just in terms of numbers and influence. So I have a feeling that eventually they come back to the realization that they also don't like Jews, as is historically the case. But in America, I can't speak on the European side. In America, the alliance is more natural among the liberal side, and it obviously splits in kind of ugly ways around issues of Israel and BDS. We've talked about this. And it's the challenge of the Democratic Party to keep the tent big enough so that Ilhan Omar and Ted Deutsch can coexist. There's so much. And by the way, the interesting thing, we haven't talked about it, it is ultimately sort of a permutation, but if you're a religious Muslim or you're a religious Jew in Europe, these things are profoundly important. There are secularizing attempts to ban kosher slaughter, halal slaughter, circumcision in various countries. And this is obviously an area where Jews and Muslims in Europe are going to find very much common cause. And it would, if you were interested in building coalitions like that, you would say, let's not talk about Israel right now. Let's talk about pastrami or something. But I'll leave it to Marc for the rest.
Well, you have to make a serious difference between, I don't think the question should be put in religious terms at all. I think it's a wrong direction. It leads you nowhere. Also, it's too much of a generalization to talk about Jews and Muslims. What we're facing is an Islamist propaganda that is distinct from the Muslim population, and then can perfectly be identified. It's the Islamist propaganda of the Muslim Brothers at this point, and the Muslim Brothers should be identified as such, as distinct from the Muslim population at large. Now, that propaganda is certainly efficient, especially among the younger population of Muslims in France. This is a real problem. Every poll indicates that the 25 to 30% of the Muslim population, and mainly among the youth, think that the religious law is above the law of the country. So it's an issue. But that doesn't mean that anyone should try to push Jews in general and Muslim in general against each other. To me, that makes no sense. Also, while I'm at it, The real question is not laïcité in France, by the way. The real question is assimilation. It's a much deeper problem than laïcité. Laïcité is a sideshow. The real issue is how do you assimilate? And it's a problem that dates back to the French Revolution and to the emancipation of the Jews. That was always a very complex issue, even at the time. We don't have time to go into that right now, but the moment where Jews were emancipated in France was very complex. One of the reasons why they were emancipated was that there was almost no Jews in the country to begin with, 40,000 people at the time. It was mainly a symbolic issue. So they were used as a model for what assimilation should be. So if you see it that way, it begins to make sense what's going on in France right now. How do you assimilate? How do you deal with, and what does assimilation mean in French terms? You know, as for Marine Le Pen's and the populist candidates defending the liberal order, that's the big difference between Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour, for instance. That's what gave room for Zemmour to maneuver, because Marine Le Pen's electorate became disappointed with her somewhat milder views on things. It also corresponds to a sociological difference with the electorate. Marine's electorate is more popular. People that are unemployed, lower classes, lower income, and so forth. Eric Zemmour apparently seduces people with a cultural background, a higher income, and in general more bourgeois, who cares more about identity, authenticity, and so forth. That's it. I'll stop here.
How about next to Chatterton Benhold with New York Times in Berlin?
Thank you, Josh. So I've got this friend in Berlin who plays in this Jewish football team, Maccabi, and he is routinely exposed to anti-Semitism, and it's really interesting because depending on which team he plays, he gets it literally on the pitch and from the stand. So, you know, he can play another Berlin team, which is majority Turkish-German, who will really throw slurs at the Jewish team. You know, Jew is the lightest of them, but there'll be worse ones. And then on the stands, if you're playing out in Brandenburg somewhere, will be the neo-Nazis who will do their own shouting. So I was talking to him recently about what the greater threat is. You know, is it the anti-Semitism coming from the far right, or is the anti-Semitism coming from the sort of Muslim or Islamist community, for lack of a better term? And his take was that judging by the statistics in Germany, where anti-Semitic violence has also gone up, like in France, it is the far right in terms of real violence, because the numbers far outweigh the attacks from the Islamic side. But in terms of verbal abuse and sort of normalization of language in schools, particularly urban areas that are very diverse, it is probably the Islamist side. So there's a kind of interesting dynamic there. I'd be curious to hear how you guys see that in America and in probably more likely in France, where the threat is greater. But I wanted to comment on something that Carolina said as well, because I think, you know, we talk at a level that is very far away from the root causes. And the one thing that I found whenever I'd done interviews with neo-Nazis or far-right extremists is that there is a sense that white Europeans are becoming a minority. And that ultimately it is about losing their country, their nation, their culture. Germans are not particularly religious, East Germans even less so, but they're even talking about that sort of Christian heritage. And to me, that in some ways is at the root of all of this. It's what Orban talks about, it's what the AfD talks about a lot. And you know, I'm curious to what extent this dynamic between Islamophobia, which at a primary level, that's the problem. It's the brown people coming in, right? It's that other religion that wants to install Sharia law in all our European countries. But then the Jews, you know, the anti-Semitism that is sort of layered over that, and that language I did not hear that language sort of pre-2017, but it's very, very common now in those circles that the Jews are the ones who have engineered that migration.
Well, that's the American
Pulling
phenomenon.
yeah,
That's the Tree of Life synagogue shooting
That's right.
phenomenon.
Yeah.
The shooter believed, based on self-radicalization on the internet, that that Jews were the engineers of the brown invasion.
Yes.
And I mean, goes to this sort of idea that if you almost have this supernatural belief in the power of Jews, you'll describe anything you want to them. I didn't know that was sort of the dynamic in Europe as well.
Yes.
But that is definitely, I mean, that was Charlottesville. Jews will not replace us, was the chant.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know. And they didn't mean that Jews were themselves going to replace. Jews were bringing in brown and black people to replace them.
Which in a way begs the question, is, you know, anti-Jewish hatred, as you call it, Jeff, is it...
Thank you for adopting my
No, I
rules.
like it. And you know, it's the sort of thing where it's really interesting because I'd never thought about the word anti-Semitism. I didn't know that an anti-Semite had invented it. So, you know, it's something maybe to even take back to the editorial team. But I think...
My work is done. I'm going to go to the spa. Okay.
Well, but the question is, does that make anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hatred, for that matter, a subset of racism, or is it really something else? Is it a different, is it a more existential? It's basically, you know, we hate brown people, we want to enslave them, we don't like them, we look down on them, but the Jews, we basically want to eradicate them. I mean, is there a different...
Yeah, it's a Ku Klux Klan rhetoric as well. It's the original rhetoric of the Klan. You know, Jews brought in the U.S. to destroy Christianity. It was the original rhetoric. And as I said, you find that in Tarrant's manifesto in New Zealand, and basically that's in post-fascist groups in Europe as well. And Renaud Camus, of course, was all about that. Is all about that. You know, migrants are bad, but the Great Replacement theory, even if it's not avowed as such, is an anti-Semitic theory. Migrants are bad, and migrants are there to replace us, but migrants have been driven to our country, led to our country by strong, more obscure forces that are made of international bankers, mostly Jewish ones, to destroy Christian civilization. That's the basic thing, you know. As for the first question, what's more dangerous, Islamic anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism? It's a very interesting question, in fact, because France is the country where the Great Replacement theory was written by Renaud Camus. Yet, in France, that theory never resulted in bloodshed in France. It did inspire killings in the U.S. and in New Zealand and elsewhere. But nobody ever acted out those theories. Nobody made those words active in France, whereas Islamists did, of course, act upon what they were saying. And it's a very interesting rhetoric in what happens in France toward violence. In the 90s, the far-right groups were all about, in far-left groups were pretty much in the same state. It was a moment of disillusion. Histories will never come back. We will never know the great glorious days where you could die and kill for your ideas. It's all about commerce today. And suddenly they saw the Islamists coming and saying, yeah, you actually can do stuff. You actually can act according to your values and your beliefs. You can kill people. And I really believe that Islamists became the secret model, the unavowed model for the extreme right today in France. When someone like Zemmour says that he admires the Kouachi brothers for having killed the journalists in Charlie Hebdo because they're doing things that we Westerners are not able to do any longer, that's exactly what he means. You know, so when you look at the Yellow Vests demonstration, for instance, during one demonstration, they staged a fake execution of Emmanuel Macron. They didn't use the guillotine. What they staged was an execution by the Islamic State. So it became a sort of, you know, that's what we aspire to. You need to remember that the more the Islamic State got gore on its videos, propagandistic videos, the more successful it was in Europe to drive people to Syria. The same youth that would say all this is propaganda from the secret services and the Mossad, the Islamic State is not actually a bunch of killers. They're just pious Muslims trying to live the life of righteous Muslims. The same guys, the same people would look at the videos, the gore videos of execution, and say, "Wow, I want to go there." So, you know, the Islamists they provide a model of sadistic heroism for people that are fed up with the system.
And probably to masculinity,
Yeah,
in a way.
exactly.
Simon Cooper, Ashley Parker, and Vincent Hugo. Simon, hit that button, if you would.
I agree with what...
Can you hit that button? Sorry.
I agree with what most of you have said, and I admired Marc's book. But I am uncomfortable about this idea that anti-Semitism in Europe is always rising. Ever since I can remember, the story has been that anti-Semitism in Europe is coming back, is rising. And it was true in the 80s when we had Jean-Marie Le Pen emerge. It's always been that story, and I'm suspicious of it. I mean, yes, there are thousands of people in France willing to commit anti-Semitic violent acts, and that's a huge problem. And it's a threat to the stability of France. But use other metrics as well in assessing anti-Semitism. Can Jews live successful, happy, fulfilled lives? Can there be public figures in France, including Zemmour? Yes, they can. Is the state sympathetic to anti-Semitism? Does it allow anti-Semitism? I would say not. Are acts of verbal and physical anti-Semitism punished in France? Do the people who make them also suffer social opprobrium often? Yes, they are. So by many metrics, I would disagree that among the mass of the French population, anti-Semitism is increasing, and I think you could tell that story about most European countries. And then to come to Zemmour, isn't it precisely because he is Jewish and he offers absolution for Vichy and, as you say, for the Mauricien point of view, that he's offering nativism and racism, but without anti-Semitism? And Marine Le Pen had been edging towards that as well for many years. She'd been trying to turn the FN and then the LN from an overtly anti-Semitic party into an anti-Muslim party. So, I mean, I can see you disagree, but just very briefly, isn't the new kind of Charles Marat in France an anti-Muslim much more than an anti-Semitic figure?
No, as I said, first of all, I would never say that Eric Zemmour is not anti-Semitic. He denies the innocence of Dreyfus. He says that Dreyfus may have been guilty. He insults the victims of the Ozar Hatorah school and claimed that they were not really French because they were too Jewish. He wrote a book on the first murder. Sébastien Selam, who was assassinated in 2003 by his childhood friend Anastasia Bou. And in this book, Zemmour argues that the real reason why Selam was killed was that he was not a good guy. So I wouldn't say that Zemmour is not anti-Semitic at all.
I didn't say that. I was saying that it was much more an anti-Muslim than
it goes together because once you begin to rehabilitate the Vichy regime, you have to endorse a certain amount of anti-Semitism, and it's precisely because he's Jewish that he can do that, as Jean-Marie Le Pen accurately said a few weeks ago. As for the notion that anti-Semitism, it's funny. We've been saying for decades that anti-Semitism was rising, and people are actually in those decades. Since those decades, people began to get killed because they were Jews. So this is the proof that anti-Semitism is not rising. We were wrong. No, I don't think so. I think things have been going worse and worse since the 80s, and we were right all along to claim that something's wrong. What's going on, though, is that it's a much more complex form of anti-Semitism than the one that we expected. But even figures like the Zemmour were not unknown in the 20s and in the 30s. One of the greatest apologists for Mussolini was Jewish in the 1920s. In France, you had a certain number of Jews that were unapologetically fascists. So it's not exactly news, figures like Zemmour. What I would say, I mean, it's always a bit of a cliche to say anti-Semitism is rising. It's a terrible tragedy. We don't know what to do. I would phrase it perhaps a bit differently. I would say that the Jewish figure, the Jewish thing, the Jewish signifiant, as we say in French, in Lacanian terms, has become a very the point of attraction of toxic forces today, and there's a reason for that. As I said before, you can't. The traditional right and the extreme right need to reconcile themselves through the figure of a Jew, and that's telling in itself. The Muslims need Jewish to kill in order to become good Muslims in France when they swallow the propaganda of the Islamist networks, and that's telling. Before the terror wave that hit everyone, there is a series of blind rage that's targeting Jews only, and it's even telling that after the Bataclan and terrorist killing, people were flabbergasted for the first time. There was a lot of terror attacks in France before that, but they were always targeting at least partly. There was always at least symbolically one or two Jewish guys to take a bullet. Then suddenly the Bataclan, it's everyone, and people were like, I mean, people said so. Even people that were in the theater that were later interviewed by journalists, they said things like, "I don't understand that. I couldn't understand a Palestinian kid that blew up with his bombs in front of me and kills me. But this was preposterous. This was not directed against Jews or journalists. This targeted everyone." Mohammed Merah said that to the cops before he was killed. I could have killed everyone I wanted. The brothers told me that I could kill homosexuals, people that kiss each other in the streets, and so forth. But I really believed that I had a message to carry, and by killing Jews and soldiers, French would understand better.
Just a couple of points on what you're saying. I agree with you. I mean that it's complicated, and I also agree that there is a sort of it's always getting worse kind of narrative. I mean, I think when I was writing and when you were writing your book, we're coming out of a series of fatal anti-Jewish terrorist attacks in France, which created an atmosphere. It was before, actually, the Corbyn issue, but the Corbyn issue is interesting because that is an interesting example of both a tension in society that actually provisionally has resolved itself in favor of the Jewish community and its interests in a kind of way, in part because the Jewish community mobilized and argued for its own rights and its own Englishness and all the rest. No, and the main reason, when I wrote this, the big piece several years ago, I noted that obviously we're not in a pre-1939 or a pre-World War II kind of period for Jews in Europe, for the very obvious reason that, at the time I was writing, obviously, that in 1939, the most important political leader in Europe was arguing for the extermination, or was arguing in code for the extermination of the Jews. And when I was writing, the most important leader defending the Jews was the Chancellor of Germany. So, I mean, the flip was total. Angela Merkel, and obviously most German leaders are, stalwart in their defense of the Jews. And I would say, to agree with you again, that something in France has changed. Right after the 1982 terrorist attack on the Joe Goldberg deli restaurant in the Marais in Paris, I forgot the name of the minister. You will remember this. You know what I'm talking about.
Which ministry?
The terrible comment was made by Raymond Barre.
Raymond.
Yeah. Raymond Barre. Yeah.
Oh, that was before. It was not the daily.
Was it
before
Goldenberg or was it something else?
No, it was before. It was a synagogue.
Oh, it was a synagogue where Raymond Barre said, he said innocent people and Jews were killed. Yeah. He was the prime minister. It was Iranian terrorism. But that was the formula. It was innocent Frenchmen and Jews were killed in this terrorist attack.
Yeah.
So France has moved, I mean, light years ahead in terms of the public governmental response. All that being said, if you look at the conditions, even after Pittsburgh and San Diego, the murders of Jews in the last couple of years by right-wing extremists in the U.S., when you compare the sort of tentative status, especially of the smaller Jewish communities, I'm thinking of Sweden and Denmark and places like that, Greece, I don't think that the Jews in Europe are standing on the same solid ground that American Jews are standing on. And obviously, America is changing and all of these things change all the time. But I do think in terms of actual numbers of people killed in terror attacks, the number of Jews has gone up in recent years. And all that being said, it seems like this has quieted down over the last 3-4 years.
Can I interject really briefly there?
Please.
It strikes me, Simon, that as soon as migration became less of an issue because the pandemic took over and more recently climate change has become more of an issue, that's when I certainly as a reporter noticed that the rhetoric also shifted far more from an Islamophobic rhetoric on the right to an anti-Jewish rhetoric. Because suddenly, you know, you're looking for an anti-elite rhetoric, and the Jews are the best target there. And this is when I noticed that the QAnon Germany types took off. So I just wanted to say that I think you're not wrong, but I think actually something has shifted in the last 2 years that's very significant with the pandemic and the deficit of trust.
And it's also incredibly important in this whole conversation, remember that each country has its individual experience. We're talking about 25, 30 different places. And so, I mean, some of these things are cross-border and some of them are not.
Yeah, things have lowered down a little bit in France, mainly for a while because as I said, the Saudis' politics changed in 2016, and that's 2017, and that was very important. And the strategy of the Muslim Brothers is different. It's more rhetorical and less direct action, but still, you have regular attacks in France today. They're just labeled psychiatry disorders. And just last week, you had a guy in front of a Jewish school armed with an axe that began to shout dirty Jews and so forth. He was stopped by police just last week.
Well, that could be interpreted any kind of way.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Who knows what he meant?
Yeah, exactly.
What was his background? Was he
I don't know.
Muslim? Or
He was Muslim. He was Muslim.
Ashley Parker with the Washington Post.
Thank you. And I apologize in advance for starting my question with the phrase when I was studying abroad. But when I was studying abroad in 2003 in Sevilla in southern Spain, I was taking an art history class, so all the cliches. But at La Universidad de Sevilla, and during a unit on the Chicago School of Architecture, they were talking about skyscrapers and steel, and that in some ways it was a sign of American arrogance. And at one point, the professor put a slide up first of the World Trade Center and then of the World Trade Center after it was hit on 9/11. It's 2003, the entire lecture hall, about 200 kids erupted in cheers. So I was struck by what you sort of mentioned offhand about how much you think Americans sort of hadn't fully grappled with the reaction. I was hoping you could expand a little bit about what you thought were the causes of that reaction in the world then to sort of celebrate those attacks. And I'm also curious what you think now, 20 years later, sort of the international reaction would be to a similar attack.
Well, at the time, I think the reaction was a mix of boredom. People were bored in the night, and they wanted something to happen. And that was the perfect thing to happen because it was happening to America, and America was the greatest power. And the general feeling was between at last something's going on, and they deserved it. For everything they did and for everything they did not do. And also you need, it's a little bit like with the Jews, you need to reassure yourself. I mean, this was also, there was part of that reaction was driven by fear. as was proved 1 year later with the arrival of Jean-Marie Le Pen on the first round of the presidentials. When you're afraid, when you see something unexplainable that happens, and dangerous and murders happening, you need an answer. I mean, the people that is targeted must be responsible somehow for what's going on, because if not, it's too scary. It means that it could happen to anyone. And that's the logic of terror. You begin by blaming the victims. And in that case, the victim being the most important, the biggest power in the world, was obviously responsible for what was going on. There's a German journalist who went to interview Philip Roth a little bit after the 9/11, and he said exactly that to Philip. He said, don't you think that the US deserved it? And Philip answered, well, if people got what they deserve, we wouldn't have stopped in Berlin and Dresden in 1945. We would have erased the whole goddamn country. That was the best answer to provide. So as for what would happen now, I don't know. This is a very different situation. It's also a much more fragmented world. Obviously, the U.S. are not in a position to do to launch a second Iraq war or an Afghanistan war. So is there a world order today? I don't know. I have no idea.
Vincent, Joe.
Okay, well, it's too late. If it's too late, just tell me.
It's
could
not
abstain.
too late.
No,
Please,
it's fine.
please.
Okay, good. My question here, when I arrived earlier today, was how long will it take before the name of Éric Zemmour is launched in the middle of the turf? Because it becomes some kind of national obsession in France. But obviously, it's significant. It tells something. I don't know to what extent everybody here is familiar with the character. I mean, life is probably too short for that, but if you happen to put a hand on his last book, and I hope it will be the last, translation, whatever, you will bump into a very lengthy ego trip with a tremendous amount of narcissism. I mean, it's an exercise of self-admiration. So it's almost laughable. What is not laughable is that it rings a bell and it works. Now, this guy, as you understood, is probable, maybe an hypothetical candidate for the next presidential election next spring in France, 2022. But it's not sure, by the way, because we have some regulations. He needs 500 signatures from elected characters, whatever. But what is interesting is that I happened to meet him 10, 15 years ago, because he was a journalist, or more accurately, he was a columnist. But originally, I'm kidding. I'm pulling many legs here. So what I mean is that when he went, it was Le Figaro, for example, obviously, a right-wing daily, but liberal, okay, blah, blah. He came to L'Express for a short period of time, too long, according to me, but very short period of time in L'Express. So he appeared as a right-winger, but more liberal than, an extremist. And then he moved from there. And that, I think this is interesting. The way I see him, because in fact, Marc covered most of the questions I wanted to ask when answering what Thomas said about this kind of paradox with the electorate, and paradox and maybe schizophrenia, I think, among many of them. But what is interesting, the way I see him, right or wrong, is something like the biological son of Arthur de Gobineau and Renaud Camus, with probably as a godfather, Philippe Pétain behind the cradle, something like that. And that precisely, his political genius, if any, is to reconcile these apparently contradictory trends. What is interesting is that you have, a toxic cocktail of, I would say, old-fashioned brand of French Catholic anti-Semitism. It's part of his potential electorate. I myself come from a working-class family from northern France, devoted Catholics, really. And this family with an uncle who was a prominent resistant, with a network anti-German, blah, blah. But this family was not immune from the die-hard stereotypes. Greediness, the East Side people, and those who confiscate the levers of power, blah, blah, blah. I mean, they were not, anti-Semitic, but they were not immune from that. It was in the air, and I think it's still in the air. Plus, obviously, the very fruitful angle of Islamophobia, which works practically. So I think Marc covered this. What I would like to ask shortly, when you referred, both of you, to the ingredients of anti-Jewish hatred, that's for you. And when I talk to youngsters from Maghreb or from sub-Saharan Africa too, or even from French Caribbean, for example, people who tend to sympathize with the heinous crimes you listed eloquently earlier, what strikes me is that their impressive level of ignorance. I mean, they couldn't put Palestine on the map. For them, 1948, it's probably an ill-spelled or an approximate brand of cheap beer. And even I'm talking about Quran with them. If I tell them you have Isa and you have Maryam in the Quran, they say, you liar. Not true. So, my question here is, to what extent their commitment or their sympathy is ideological, and to what extent it is just instinctive, if not, Pavlovian, not theorized whatsoever. And that's why I would like to know where you put the balance between the social roots of that kind of behavior and speeches and action sometimes, and the part of an efficient propaganda, a method, an ideological adhesion. Where do you put this? For me, it's still a mystery.
It's quite simple. Obviously, the more ignorant you are, the more easier you can be targeted by any kind of propaganda. But ignorance is not just a thing for the lower classes. I remember in the early 2000s when the peace process collapsed. While I was in this magazine I told about earlier, the people that went straight to a pro-Palestinian position knew nothing of what existed in the Middle East before 1948. They knew nothing of the 6 Day War. They literally did not know what existed before the creation of the Israeli state in 1948. Those were journalists, people that were intellectually structured and supposedly educated. They knew nothing about it. All they knew was that the Palestinian kids were, as they said, I heard that, I don't make it up. Palestinian kids were the new rockers, like in rock and roll. That was the general mindset. So ignorance takes many forms, and certainly in France, there's a tremendous amount of ignorance regarding the Jewish history. You won't find one French who can tell you what the history of French Jews is in France. It does not exist. The history of that population has been simply erased, and even among educated people. They will tell you a lot about what they think they know of colonization, of the history of migrant workers in France, and they don't know much. In fact, they write a lot about it, but they don't know a lot. It's amazing to see. As it turns out, I've been working on migration in the early 80s. I started that way. I was part of a journal that helped to set up la première marche des beurs, the first march in 1983. So I was one of the first reporters to go in those suburbs in the early 80s. People that write today about that on an ideological basis don't know what they're talking about. So there's a lot of ignorance on what the country is made of, and it's certainly about the Jews has been literally erased of the French history. And it's one of the problems, because when you start a public debate or when you start a radio show, as I do, on the subject, people know literally nothing. So even writing the basic facts requires a tremendous effort, you know?
Very shortly, what strikes me again when talking to that kind of guys is that at the end of the day, the message should be something like, at least and at last I do exist. I have some kind of identity, as brutal as it may appear and sound, but I mean, I'm part of something. I don't want to create an artificial bypass to the next session, but I mean, this matter of at least I have some kind of identity appears, I think, very, very instrumental in the shaping of that self-justification, let's say.
It's a perfect bridge comment, the identity piece, which we'll get into a little bit more today. Jeff, do you want to weigh in on this too?
Just as a way of sort of closing out a little bit. It's interesting to listen to this conversation because one of the reasons anti-Semitism, or whatever we're calling it right now, is difficult to understand is that it doesn't have any parallel to other prejudices in a kind of way, both because of the immensely long timeline. I mean, you could date this back to the Syrian Greeks of 2,200 years ago, and certainly you could date the sort of formation of anti-Semitic ideology to the decision by Paul and the early Christians to reject the mother religion and create another religion in opposition to the mother religion. And so it's timeless in a sense. It's eternal, and it manifests itself in so many different ways in different places. One of the interesting things about anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hatred is that unlike prejudices against, let's say, migrants or Muslims or brown or black people in America, or however you want to frame it, it's not just that it's not that the Jews are somehow low class or dirty or whatever the prejudices are that are directed against. It's that the prejudice is directed against their power, and that makes it, or their supposed power, and that's what makes this sort of unique. And it's the shape-shifting quality of the hatred that makes it sort of ineradicable. And I think this conversation is part of an endless conversation about how do you eradicate something that's ineradicable. One of the ways you eradicate something that's ineradicable, move toward eradication, is to value complexity, to value moderation, centrism in the political sense. And I think we're just generally speaking in a moment in a lot of our countries where extremes are being rewarded, not only online, but the social media echo chamber obviously helps. And so it's a particularly fraught moment. I would also just add that this is the central contradiction, I think, from a Jewish perspective, is despite the various pressures that American Jews might face, despite the continued existential dangers that the Jews of Israel might face, and despite what's happening in Europe, there's never actually been a better time in Jewish history than right now. I mean, that's the sort of oddity of the moment. You have 14, 15, 16 million Jews in the world. A majority or plurality live in Israel, where with all of its flaws and obviously all of the contingencies, they have economic and self-defense autonomy for the first time in 2,000 years. And it's a powerful country, little country, but a powerful country. And they live fully Jewishly. And they fight amongst themselves, obviously, like cats and dogs. That's the nature of it. The bulk of the rest of the Jews live in North America, which is, still for all of the problems, kind of a sui generis diaspora experience. And there are Jewish communities that are doing fine in Europe and in Latin America and elsewhere. They're more contingent, they have more pressures, they're smaller, they have challenges that are unrelated to anti-Semitism, that are more related to just demographic continuity. But those challenges are, the challenges you take any day of the week over actual prejudice. It's like, the old line, the Irving Kristol line about America and the Jewish population is that the challenge for Jews in America is not that Christians want to kill us; it's that they want to marry us. And that was that was the sort of central understanding of the challenge of assimilation. So the point is that it's a great time at least since the Romans sacked the Second Temple. This is probably the best time to be Jewish in world history, and so it's good to keep that in proportion when we talk about all of these challenges to a particular group of people.
Thank you, Marc, and thank you, Jeff, for a brilliant talk. First start.